This week on 60 Minutes, I interviewed Prince Harry about his book, Spare, and it's an interview not just about all the drama that's gone on and continues to go on, the rift with the royal family, but also about his life.
It was supposed to be a controlled interview until the questions stopped following the script. When Meghan Markle sat down with 60 Minutes, expectations were clear: polished answers, familiar narratives, and a carefully managed image. But within moments, the tone shifted. The questions became sharper, the pauses grew longer, and for the first time in a long time, the conversation felt unpredictable. Viewers noticed it, and the internet hasn't stopped talking about it since. So what actually happened in that interview? What was said, and what was avoided? Join us as we reveal what question threw Meghan off. A perfectly laid trap. The 60 Minutes studio was deliberately arranged for maximum psychological impact. Unlike the cozy, sympathetic setting Meghan had enjoyed during her infamous Oprah interview, this environment was stark and professional. 2 chairs positioned at an angle, neutral lighting designed to capture every facial expression, and cameras strategically placed to record every moment of discomfort. When Meghan arrived, she brought what insiders described as an unnecessarily large entourage: multiple publicists, handlers, a personal stylist, and what appeared to be a crisis management consultant, all crowded into the green room. They spent nearly an hour fussing over every detail, repositioning the chairs, adjusting the lighting, and even requesting specific camera angles. The 60 Minutes crew, used to accommodating world leaders and CEOs, found the demands excessive and telling. Anderson Cooper watched this circus with amusement. He had interviewed presidents who arrived with less fanfare. The excessive preparation signaled something important. Meghan was terrified of being interviewed and wasn't sure about how prepared she was. All the handlers and staging couldn't hide the fact that she knew this interview would be different from the softball sessions she had become accustomed to. When the entourage finally cleared and Meghan settled into her chair, her body language told a fascinating story. She positioned herself at an angle, creating physical distance while maintaining what her media training had likely taught her was an open and approachable posture.
You need to make a salad. Let's just go and eat cheese. You know that's my life dream.
I love these moments of discovery and beauty.
Her hands were clasped in her lap, her expression arranged into a practiced look of serene confidence. Everything about her presentation screamed control. Anderson's opening was deceptively gentle. He thanked her for coming, mentioned how much interest there was in her story, and asked a simple question about how she was adjusting to life in California. It seemed innocuous, the kind of warm-up question any interviewer might start with. But for those who knew Anderson's technique, it was the beginning of a masterclass in investigative journalism. Meghan's response was rehearsed, almost scripted. She talked about freedom, about finally being able to live authentically, about the relief of escaping institutional constraints. Her voice had that measured quality of someone delivering prepared talking points. Anderson nodded along, his expression neutral and encouraging. He let her talk, let her settle into the rhythm of her prepared narrative. And then, so subtly that Meghan didn't notice the shift, he began the real interview. But would Meghan's carefully rehearsed answers hold up once Anderson started digging deeper into her contradictions? Let's find out. The first cracks. The transition was seamless. Anderson acknowledged her comments about freedom and then asked a question that seemed logical but was actually devastating. You've mentioned wanting less scrutiny, but you've done multiple documentaries, podcast deals, and interviews since leaving royal life. Aren't you actually seeking more attention than ever? Meghan's expression flickered. Just for a second, the mask slipped, revealing irritation underneath. She recovered quickly, launching into an explanation about the difference between wanted and unwanted attention, and between telling her own story versus being victimized by tabloid narratives. It sounded reasonable on the surface, the kind of answer that worked well in controlled environments. But Anderson wasn't letting it go. With precision, he pointed out that the end result was identical. Her life was under constant public examination either way. The only difference was who controlled the narrative. And if she truly wanted privacy, why was she constantly putting herself in the public eye through projects that invited scrutiny? This is where things started to unravel. Meghan's calm facade began cracking as she realized Anderson wasn't going to accept surface-level answers. He was asking follow-up questions, probing contradictions, refusing to move on when her responses didn't actually address the questions. For someone used to Oprah-style sympathetic nodding, this must have felt like an ambush. The tension in the room became palpable. Meghan's voice took on a defensive edge. She started using phrases like, "That's not fair," and "You don't understand," classic deflection techniques that work on sympathetic interviewers, but only make investigative journalists more curious. Anderson remained perfectly calm, his tone never changing, his questions becoming sharper, even as his demeanor stayed gentle. He brought up the Netflix deal, the Spotify podcast that ended in disaster, and the various projects announced and then quietly canceled.
Just thetig.com, and it's actually where UN Women reached out to me because I had written a think piece.
Each question was phrased neutrally, but each one highlighted a pattern of failure. Meghan tried to spin these as evolution, as creative differences, or as the natural ebb and flow of the entertainment industry. Anderson countered by pointing out that most people's projects don't consistently fail, and that most content creators actually produce content when paid millions of dollars to do so. The look on Meghan's face was priceless. She clearly wasn't prepared for this level of accountability. In her world of controlled media appearances and friendly interviewers, no one had ever actually challenged her explanations. No one had pointed out that producing 12 podcast episodes in 3 years while being paid $20 million was objectively terrible value. No one had asked why every major deal she'd signed had ended badly. Anderson was doing something revolutionary in the context of Meghan Markle interviews. He was treating her like any other public figure making serious claims. No special treatment, no walking on eggshells, no accepting vague answers, just straightforward journalism asking straightforward questions. But if Meghan was struggling with questions about her failed business ventures, how would she handle Anderson's next topic, the explosive racism allegations that had rocked the royal family? The racism question. Then came the question that would become the defining moment of the entire disaster. Anderson, in his characteristic measured tone, brought up Meghan's racism allegations. He acknowledged that these were serious, important claims that deserved serious attention. And then he asked her to be specific. The change in Meghan was immediate and dramatic. Her entire body stiffened. Her expression closed off completely. The practiced warmth disappeared, replaced by something cold and hostile. This was clearly a topic she'd expected to discuss on her own terms, delivering prepared statements that would be accepted without challenge. Instead, Anderson was asking for details. Who said what? When did it happen? What were the exact words used? These are basic journalistic questions, the minimum follow-up any serious reporter would ask about such explosive allegations. But Meghan had never faced them before. Oprah had accepted her vague implications. Netflix had let her craft her own narrative. Now she was being asked to actually substantiate claims that had damaged an entire institution. Her response was telling. She fell back on emotional appeals, saying she'd already discussed this and didn't want to relive painful moments. Anderson, gently but firmly, pointed out that she'd never actually discussed specifics. She'd made vague accusations that left everyone under suspicion while protecting no one. He asked how that was ethical or fair. Meghan tried to frame her vagueness as protecting relationships. Anderson's response was devastating. You protected someone while destroying everyone else's reputation with suspicion. Now the entire family is suspected. Is that better? The logic was irrefutable. By making broad accusations without specifics, Meghan had actually done maximum damage while maintaining maximum deniability. This is when Meghan first tried to stand up. It was a false start, an aborted attempt to leave that she caught herself making.
We are proud to be able to join you tonight.
The cameras captured it perfectly. The instinctive flight response, the realization that walking out would look terrible, the awkward settling back into the chair. Anderson noticed but didn't comment, letting the moment speak for itself. He pressed on, pointing out that vague accusations serve the accuser because they can't be challenged or disproven. They just hang in the air, harming everyone while protecting the person who made them. It's a powerful tactic for narrative control, but terrible journalism and worse ethics. Meghan's composure was completely gone now. She accused Anderson of doing exactly what the British press had done, attacking her credibility rather than believing her experience. It was a clever rhetorical move that attempted to reframe legitimate questions as victimization. But Anderson had decades of experience with people trying to manipulate interviews. His response was perfect. "I'm doing what any reasonable person does when presented with serious claims, asking for evidence. That's not attacking your credibility. That's basic journalism. And the fact that you interpret questions as attacks is concerning." The tension was reaching a boiling point, and Meghan was visibly rattled. But could things possibly get worse when Anderson shifted the conversation to her relationship with Harry? The Harry deflection. When Anderson tried to shift topics to give Meghan a chance to recover, he asked about Harry. The reaction was immediate and furious. Meghan declared that she preferred not to discuss her husband, citing privacy concerns. The absurdity of this claim, given that she'd literally produced a 6-hour Netflix documentary about their relationship, wasn't lost on Anderson. With a slight smile, the only crack in his professional demeanor all night, he pointed out the obvious contradiction. How could she claim privacy for someone she'd put at the center of multiple public projects? Meghan tried to argue that she could choose what to share and when. Anderson agreed, but noted that once you've made something public, you can't claim it back as private. You can't sell your story and then refuse to discuss the parts that become inconvenient. That's not how it works. This exchange revealed a crucial aspect of Meghan's media strategy. She wanted complete control, the ability to share when it benefited her, to claim privacy when questioned, to craft narratives without accountability. She'd gotten away with this in controlled environments, but 60 Minutes doesn't work that way. Anderson then asked a question that cut to the heart of everything. What is your individual identity separate from Harry? It was brilliant because it exposed how Meghan's entire post-royal narrative was dependent on her connection to Harry. Remove him from the conversation, and there wasn't much left to discuss. Every project, every interview, every public appearance was about their joint story. Her claim to individual identity rang hollow when examined. Meghan couldn't answer. She literally sat there in silence, unable to articulate what her individual contribution or identity was. For someone who positioned herself as a feminist and independent woman, this inability to define herself apart from her husband was stunning and revealing. With Meghan already struggling to defend her privacy claims and personal identity, Anderson wasn't done yet. Next came the financial questions that would push her completely over the edge. The project disaster. Anderson then pivoted to examining Meghan's professional ventures in detail. The Spotify deal that imploded. The Netflix projects are being canceled. The podcast that a Spotify executive publicly called a grift. Each failure was presented neutrally, but the pattern was damning. Meghan tried to blame misaligned visions and industry evolution. Anderson wasn't buying it. He pointed out that successful content creators actually create content. They don't sign $20 million deals and then produce barely anything over 3 years. They don't have project after project canceled because they can't deliver. The question Anderson asked was brutal in its simplicity. What were you doing with all that time and money? Meghan had no good answer. She fell back on vague references to being thoughtful about quality and working under pressure. Anderson immediately asked what pressure exactly she was under while being paid millions to create content with complete creative control. This line of questioning was devastating because it exposed Meghan's fundamental problem. She wants to be treated as a serious content creator and businesswoman, but her track record shows someone who can't deliver on promises. The money she's been paid has resulted in minimal output and maximum drama. When Anderson mentioned that industry insiders were starting to question whether the problem was the product itself rather than the company's, Meghan lost it. This was the moment the interview truly collapsed. She stood up abruptly, startling the crew, and declared that this was exactly what she expected, another attack disguised as journalism. The professional Duchess facade had completely shattered, revealing someone who couldn't handle even basic accountability. But was Meghan really about to walk out, or would she try to regain control of the rapidly deteriorating interview? The complete meltdown on camera. Anderson remained seated, looking up at her with an expression of mild curiosity that must have been infuriating. He calmly asked which questions constituted attacks. He listed them, asking about her experiences, requesting specifics about racism claims, inquiring about Harry, examining her professional ventures. None of these were unreasonable or hostile. They were standard journalistic inquiries. But Meghan was beyond reason now. She accused Anderson of prosecuting rather than questioning, of having an agenda, of attacking rather than engaging. Her voice was rising, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. The woman who'd walked in projecting serene confidence was now visibly furious, unable to control her emotions or her narrative. Anderson's response was masterful. He pointed out that after 30 years of interviewing everyone from genocide survivors to dictators, almost everyone had managed to engage with difficult questions without treating them as personal attacks. The implication was clear. If Meghan couldn't handle basic questions, the problem was with her, not the questions. He noted that she'd been defensive from the moment she sat down, treating every inquiry as a threat. This wasn't engagement, and it suggested someone whose story couldn't withstand scrutiny, who needed complete control to maintain her narrative. Meghan grabbed her belongings, declaring the interview over, but she couldn't resist one final confrontation. In a voice shaking with barely controlled rage, she launched into a speech about journalists with agendas, about questions that are really accusations, about people pretending to seek truth while actually seeking gotcha moments. Anderson had remained calm throughout the entire interview, but would he finally lose his composure as Meghan prepared to storm out? No, he did not. Anderson stood slowly, his demeanor never changing. What he said next would become legendary in journalism circles. He talked about interviewing people who'd survived unimaginable horrors, parents who'd lost children, and victims and perpetrators of terrible crimes. Almost all of them, even the worst people he'd interviewed.
I couldn't do it because it drove me nuts. She didn't know, so I got a friend of mine to do it who's much more patient than me.
Had managed to engage with difficult questions without treating them as personal attacks. The comparison was damning. Meghan, a privileged duchess living in a California mansion, couldn't handle basic questions about her own public statements. People who'd experienced real trauma, real suffering, and real persecution had shown more grace and engagement than someone whose primary complaint was that being a princess was hard. But Anderson wasn't finished yet. He had one more devastating observation that would leave Meghan speechless. The final confrontation about truth versus narrative. As Meghan headed for the door, Anderson delivered what would become the most quoted moment of the entire interview. He noted that he'd interviewed war criminals who stayed until the end, politicians caught in scandals who answered every question. Yet Meghan was leaving because he'd asked her to explain her own public statements. Think about what that says, he concluded. The silence that followed was deafening. Meghan stopped in the doorway, caught between her desire to flee and her inability to let Anderson have the last word. She declared that history would vindicate her, a classic line from people losing arguments. Anderson's response was gentle but devastating. He suggested that maybe history would see someone who had extraordinary opportunities and spent most of her time complaining about them. Someone who could have used her platform for almost anything and chose to use it primarily for grievance. Someone who had everything and still felt wronged. The cameras captured every moment of Meghan's face as these words hit home. Rage, hurt, frustration, and something else. The terrible realization that he might be right. That her carefully constructed victim narrative was being seen through by someone who couldn't be intimidated or manipulated. Anderson's final words were almost kind. I hope you find peace. But peace isn't something you find by arguing with everyone who sees you clearly. It was the truth, delivered with surgical precision, and Meghan had no response to it. The door closing behind her with a decisive click that echoed through the studio. Anderson sat in silence for a moment, before turning to address the camera directly. His assessment was simple. In all his years of interviewing, he'd rarely had someone walk out before finishing. That a duchess left because he asked about her projects and racism claims was unprecedented. The cameras had stopped rolling and Meghan had fled the building. But what would happen when this explosive footage finally aired to the public? A narrative in ruins. The interview, or rather the spectacular failure of it, lasted only 24 minutes, but its impact reverberated for far longer. The footage, when it aired, broke viewing records for 60 minutes. Social media exploded, with reactions ranging from shock to satisfaction to schadenfreude. For Anderson Cooper, it was another professional triumph, a demonstration of what happens when someone used to controlled media environments.
I think you feel really confident that it was divinely ordered. Maybe all of this, our friendship, you becoming our...
Finally encounters real journalism. He'd asked basic questions and let Meghan expose herself with how she answered them. He didn't need to attack or ambush. He simply held her accountable for her own public statements. For Meghan Markle, it was a disaster of epic proportions. The interview became instant evidence that her narrative couldn't survive scrutiny. Every carefully crafted talking point had fallen apart under the most basic questioning. Her victim story, so effective with sympathetic interviewers, had revealed itself as unable to withstand journalistic inquiry. The publicity team went into overdrive, trying to spin the walkout as a principled stand against hostile journalism. But the footage told a different story. Viewers could see for themselves that Anderson's questions were fair, his tone was professional, and Meghan's reactions were disproportionate and defensive. Think pieces flooded the internet. Some criticized Anderson for being too aggressive, though these claims fell flat when people actually watched the interview and saw his calm, measured approach. Others praised him for finally holding Meghan accountable, for asking the questions that needed to be asked. The most damaging assessments came from other journalists. Many noted that if Meghan couldn't handle 60 minutes level questioning, she had no business making serious public accusations. If her story fell apart under basic scrutiny, perhaps the story itself was the problem. The interview had exposed Meghan's vulnerabilities. But what exactly did it reveal about her entire media strategy? What the Anderson Cooper interview revealed was the fragility of Meghan's carefully constructed narrative. In controlled environments like the Oprah interview or her Netflix documentary, she could present herself as a victim of institutional racism and cruelty. Sympathetic interviewers accepted her claims without challenge.
And I think a lot of that gets lost in what can be super dehumanizing when you look at the clickbait culture and
creating the impression of a brave woman speaking truth to power. But 60 Minutes isn't a controlled environment. Anderson Cooper isn't a friendly interviewer lobbing softball questions. He's a serious journalist with decades of experience holding powerful people accountable. And when Meghan faced that level of scrutiny, her entire narrative collapsed. The interview exposed several key problems with Meghan's public strategy. First, her reliance on vague accusations that can't be challenged or disproven. Her inability to engage with legitimate questions without treating them as attacks. Her contradiction of claiming privacy while constantly seeking publicity. Her professional track record of failed projects and undelivered promises. Each of these issues had been visible before, but previous interviewers either didn't notice or didn't care to press. Anderson noticed everything and pressed on all of it. The result was a masterclass in how narratives built on sympathy rather than substance crumble when examined seriously. But beyond just exposing contradictions, what would be the long-term impact of this disastrous interview on Meghan's career and reputation? A reputation destroyed. The 60 Minutes interview became the moment Meghan Markle's credibility died. Before, supporters could claim she'd never been properly questioned, that her accusers were biased, that the media was unfair. After, there was video evidence of exactly what happened when she faced straightforward journalism. She couldn't handle it. The interview footage became reference material, played repeatedly whenever Meghan made new claims or gave new interviews. It stood as permanent evidence that her story doesn't hold up under scrutiny, that her accusations are vague because they can't withstand specific examination, and her victim narrative requires sympathetic acceptance rather than critical analysis. For the royal family, the interview was somewhat vindicating. For years, they'd maintained dignified silence while Meghan made accusations they couldn't defend against without appearing to attack her. Now she'd proven on her own that her claims collapsed when questioned. The palace didn't need to say anything. Anderson Cooper had done it for them. The business impact was equally significant. After the interview aired, Several projects Meghan had in development quietly disappeared. Companies that might have considered working with her reconsidered. Who wants to partner with someone who can't handle basic media inquiries? Who wants to invest in someone with a track record of failed projects and public meltdowns? The Anderson Cooper interview stands as one of the most important media moments of the decade, not because of what was revealed, but because of what was proven. It demonstrated that some narratives can only survive in protected environments, that some stories fall apart under the most basic scrutiny, and that media manipulation has limits. Meghan Markle walked into that studio expecting another opportunity to control her narrative. Instead, she encountered a journalist who asked her to defend it. The difference between those two things proved fatal to her credibility. For Anderson Cooper, it was another day at work.
Lies are used to divide us, to weaken confidence in journalism and in the core institutions.
Another interview where he asked obvious questions and let the subject's responses tell the story. That this particular subject couldn't handle what he does routinely wasn't his failure. The ticking of the 60-minute stopwatch has marked countless historical moments over 50-plus years. On this particular Sunday, it marked something simpler but no less significant. The moment a duchess discovered that carefully constructed narratives don't survive contact with serious journalism and that walking out of an interview is really just another way of admitting defeat. What do you think about this explosive interview? Was Anderson Cooper justified in his questioning, or did he cross a line? How would you have responded to Meghan's accusations of unfair treatment? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.